An arrogant police officer, holding a cup of hot coffee, deliberately threw it at a black woman just because she had the courage to stand up for herself. What he didn't realize was that this woman was the newly appointed and highly respected police chief. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. A calm woman walked into the busy police station, her movements confident but understated. She wore a plain dark shirt and simple jeans, her black hair neatly tied back. The other officers barely glanced at her, dismissing her as just another civilian, probably there to file a complaint or ask for help. She didn't seem like anyone special to them. "What do you want?" asked Officer Greg Turner, a burly officer with a cold, unfeeling stare. He was sitting at the front desk, barely looking up from his computer screen as he spoke. His tone was sharp, clearly irritated by her presence. "I need to report an incident," the woman said, her voice calm yet firm. Greg raised his head slightly, looking her up and down with a dismissive frown. "Another one, huh?" he sneered, letting out a mocking laugh loud enough for the others in the room to hear. "Let me guess. Phone? Purse? Those never turn up again, lady." The room fell into a brief, awkward silence as other officers exchanged glances. The woman, however, wasn't fazed by his words. She locked eyes with Greg and replied firmly, "I want to file a report." "It's my right." Greg's smile faded, his patience running thin. Without saying anything, he stood up, grabbed his coffee cup from the desk, and moved toward her. Some officers around the room glanced up, sensing the tension but not intervening. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Greg Turner moved closer to the woman. His tall frame towered over her, but she didn't flinch. The few officers scattered throughout the room exchanged wary glances, sensing the growing discomfort between the two. Greg, known for his arrogance and aggressive demeanor, clearly saw this woman as an easy target for his disdain. His smirk was wide, his attitude dismissive. "Let me guess. Another lost phone or purse, right?" Greg said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gave her a once-over, not even trying to hide his judgment. He grabbed his coffee cup from the desk and took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on her, as if daring her to say something. "Those things never turn up again, lady. What do you expect us to do about it?" The woman stood firm, her back straight and her eyes unwavering. "I'm here to file a report," she said, her tone calm, but with a clear authority behind it. "I have a right to file a report. I don't need your assumptions." Her words were sharp, but there was no anger in her voice, just quiet confidence. Greg's expression soured as he set his coffee cup down with a hard thud, clearly irritated by her refusal to be intimidated. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You think we have time to entertain every little complaint that comes through that door? There's a line, you know." The woman didn't blink. "I'm not here for entertainment. I'm here to do things properly," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Greg let out a mocking laugh, loud enough for others in the room to hear. He turned back to his computer, pretending to type something, clearly dismissing her. "Properly? Right. This will be a waste of time, like always. I'm sure it's just another misplaced phone or stolen purse. Those never turn up again." He gave her a final glance, his smirk widening. "But hey, I'm sure you know that already, don't you?" The room went silent for a moment as the other officers glanced over, unsure of how to react. Some shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with Greg's treatment of the woman, but no one spoke up. Greg was the one with the badge, after all. The woman's resolve only seemed to test his patience further. "I'm filing a report. That's my right, and you will take it seriously," she said, standing taller now, making it clear that she wouldn't back down. Greg's patience finally snapped. His expression twisted into one of disdain as he stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. He grabbed his coffee cup and walked toward the woman, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet station. As he moved closer, a few officers glanced up, sensing the tension escalating, but they said nothing. The woman stood still, unwavering. Greg moved right in front of her, close enough that she could smell the bitterness of the coffee on his breath. He leaned in, his face now just inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you?" Greg sneered, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You're just another civilian, making a scene. We deal with real criminals here, not whiny people who think they're entitled to attention." He took another slow sip of his coffee, all the while locking eyes with her. The woman didn't flinch. She remained calm, her expression unchanging. "I'm here to file a report. I'm not going to leave until I do." Greg, now visibly irritated, let out a sarcastic laugh, shaking his head. "Fine. If you really want to file a report so badly, go ahead." He turned back to his desk, picking up his computer mouse like he was dismissing her. "But don't expect anything to change. We're too busy dealing with real cases to bother with this nonsense." Just as Greg sat back down, the door to the station opened with a sudden force. The room fell quiet as a woman stepped inside, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was dressed in a sharp, professional uniform, her hair pulled back neatly. She walked toward the front desk, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Greg. "Is there a problem here, Officer Turner?" she asked, her voice steady and authoritative. Greg froze mid-motion, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. His eyes widened as he stared at the woman. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that immediately stood out from the civilians who walked in and out of the station every day. He quickly set the cup down, his confident smirk disappearing as he stood up. "No, ma'am," Greg stammered, his usual arrogance faltering. "Just handling a report here." He glanced nervously toward the woman at the desk, but she wasn't backing down. The woman didn't take her eyes off Greg as she stepped closer. "I'm not sure you understand," she said, her voice now tinged with authority, "but I'm the one handling things here today." She looked at the woman standing at the desk, still calm and composed. "Go ahead. File your report." Greg's face turned pale. He stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, unsure of why the woman at the desk had suddenly become the center of attention. The room was tense, the other officers in the station now watching, some curious, others too stunned to speak. The woman turned to Greg, her gaze piercing. "I think it's time you stepped aside, Officer Turner," she said calmly. "You're dismissed." Greg's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The reality of the situation had finally set in, and the consequences of his earlier actions were beginning to sink in. The woman at the desk wasn't just anyone. She was in charge. And it was clear now that his behavior had crossed a line he couldn't ignore. The other officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Some were surprised by the sudden shift in power, while others were silently relieved to see someone stand up to Greg. As the tension in the room lingered, the woman at the desk remained steady, her authority clear. Lily Moore stood tall in the heart of the police station, her presence commanding attention as she faced Officer Greg Turner. Her eyes never wavered from him as she spoke, her words measured but heavy with authority. She had just stepped into the station, expecting a routine report. But what she had encountered was far from ordinary. She wasn't just confronting an officer's bad behavior. She was standing up for what was right, ready to shift the culture of a department that had long tolerated disrespect. Greg Turner, on the other hand, was struggling to comprehend the situation unfolding before him. His smug demeanor, usually so confident and controlling, had evaporated. The woman standing before him wasn't just a civilian, as he had assumed. She was his superior, the new police chief, and she was not going to let his actions slide. For a moment, the silence in the room was deafening. The other officers who had been watching the interaction unfold were now frozen, unsure of how to react. Some had exchanged glances earlier, sensing that something was off, but none had expected this. Greg, still shaken, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His arrogance, the one thing that had always allowed him to push people around, was now useless. His earlier mocking behavior toward Lily felt like a lifetime ago. He hadn't just disrespected her. He had crossed a line, and now he was going to pay for it. "I didn't know," Greg finally muttered, his voice faltering. "I thought you were just another woman who didn't know what she was talking about." Lily's gaze hardened. "Does it matter who I am?" she asked, her tone unwavering. "You should have treated me with respect the moment I walked in that door. I don't care if I'm a civilian or a police chief. No one should be treated the way you treated me. And I'm not going to let this slide. Your behavior today isn't just unprofessional. It's unacceptable." Greg stood there, speechless. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him so directly, and he certainly hadn't expected the force of authority she carried with her. In his mind, he had always believed that people like her, people who weren't one of them, were easy targets. He thought that as an officer, he was above them. And yet, here she was, not just taking charge, but showing him how wrong he was. Lily's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the power behind her words. "This is not just about me. This is about the culture we allow in this department. You're not the only one who thinks like this, Greg. But you will be the last one to treat a civilian, any civilian, this way again." As Lily spoke, the other officers began to shift in their seats. Some were starting to look uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Others, the ones who had been complicit in the quiet tolerance of disrespectful behavior, were beginning to reflect on their own actions. They knew this wasn't just about Greg anymore. It was about the changes they would have to make in order to create a department that treated everyone with dignity. "Greg," Lily continued, her gaze now sweeping across the room, "this isn't just your problem. It's everyone's. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and the rest of you should think long and hard about the choices you're making when you let things like this slide." The silence grew heavier. No one spoke up. No one challenged her words. For the first time in a long time, the department was facing a reckoning, one they hadn't expected, but one they couldn't ignore. Greg finally looked down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The bravado he once carried was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. "I didn't mean to," he began, but the words sounded hollow even as he said them. He knew that nothing he said would take back the insult he had thrown at Lily, or at every person who had ever walked into that station, expecting respect only to be met with scorn. Lily's response was calm, but her eyes burned with intensity. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you did." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before adding, "And what happens next will matter even more." Greg looked up, his eyes filled with the first genuine sense of remorse he'd felt all day. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Lily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the other officers in the room. Their eyes were now locked on her, some ashamed, others still unsure of how to proceed. She could feel their judgment, but more than that, she felt the weight of their silent support. It wasn't just about holding Greg accountable. It was about setting the tone for what the department would stand for moving forward. "Greg, you're going to be reported," Lily said, her voice firm. "I'm filing a formal complaint, and you'll be facing consequences for your actions. We can't allow this kind of behavior to continue. Not here. Not anywhere." Greg's face went pale. "I understand," he said quietly. He didn't dare argue. He knew this was the beginning of the end for him in this department. The walls had finally closed in on him, and there was no way out. Lily turned her attention back to the woman standing at the desk. "Now, let's get your report filed," she said, her tone softening just a bit. The woman had been quiet through the entire exchange, but now she nodded, grateful for the opportunity to finally be heard. Lily walked over to the desk and began filling out the necessary forms, her authority evident in every move she made. As she worked, the room began to settle. The officers who had been unsure of the new chief's leadership began to see a glimpse of what she stood for. She wasn't just another figurehead. She was someone who would hold people accountable, someone who would challenge the status quo, and someone who would fight for respect, not just for herself, but for everyone in her department. The atmosphere in the police station had shifted. What began as a routine visit for Lily Moore had turned into a turning point for the entire department. Greg Turner, once a confident officer whose arrogance went unchecked, stood silently at the back of the room, watching as Lily finalized the report. He knew his actions had crossed a line, but it wasn't just about the coffee he had thrown. It was about the larger issue of respect and accountability within the force. Lily finished the report and handed it to the receptionist, her movements deliberate and professional. She had done more than just file a report. She had made a statement. Her presence, her quiet but unyielding leadership, was already beginning to create change, but there was still more to do. The real work was just beginning. "Greg," she said, turning back toward him, "I'm going to make sure this goes through the proper channels. You will be held accountable for your actions." Greg stood there, his face drained of color, his posture slumped in shame. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't think—" Lily cut him off, her voice stern but not unkind. "Your apology doesn't change what happened, Greg. It's not just about saying sorry. It's about showing respect every day. It's about recognizing that your actions have consequences." The other officers in the room stood still, watching the exchange. Some of them, who had witnessed Greg's behavior in the past and hadn't spoken up, now shifted uncomfortably. It was clear that they, too, were beginning to understand the magnitude of what Lily was saying. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about creating a culture where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, was treated with dignity and respect. One of the Officer Jenna, who had been sitting quietly during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Chief, if I may," she began, her voice tentative. "I want to apologize. I've seen things like this before, and I didn't do anything about it. I didn't say anything, but now I realize how wrong that was." Lily turned to her, her expression softening. "Jenna, you're not alone in that. We all have work to do, and it starts by speaking up, by making it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. We are all responsible for each other." Jenna nodded, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I want to help. I want to do better." Lily smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke volumes. "I'm glad to hear that. We all have a role in this change. It's not just about me. It's about all of us working together." The room grew quieter, the officers now reflecting on what had just happened. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. For the first time, they saw a future where respect wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Greg, standing near the back of the room, finally spoke up. His voice was shaky, but there was an honesty in it that hadn't been there before. "I don't deserve to be here anymore, do I?" Lily's gaze never left him, but her tone softened. "I'm not going to make that decision for you, Greg. That's something you'll have to think about for yourself. But understand this, you don't get to treat people the way you did and expect no consequences. You don't get to hide behind your badge and think you're untouchable." Greg nodded. His eyes filled with regret. He had always thought he was above the rules, that his position as an officer gave him the right to act however he wanted. But now, standing in the presence of someone who embodied true leadership and respect, he could see how wrong he had been. "I'll do better," Greg said quietly. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I'll try." Lily nodded. "That's all I can ask for." She turned to the other officers in the room. "And for all of you, this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust, both inside this department and with the community we serve. But it starts with us. It starts with each one of you." As the room settled into an almost reverent silence, Lily's words hung in the air. The officers knew she wasn't just talking about policies or rules. She was talking about creating a culture where every person was valued, where bias and prejudice had no place, and where accountability was the standard, not the exception. The following weeks saw significant changes in the department. Lily Moore, as the newly appointed police chief, began implementing training programs focused on racial bias, respect, and community relations. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to such behavior now found themselves actively working to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. Greg, though still facing consequences for his actions, began to take responsibility. He attended the training sessions, and he spoke up in meetings about his past mistakes. It wasn't easy for him, but it was necessary. He understood that true growth only came when you were willing to face your flaws and actively work to change. The officers who had watched the incident unfold in silence now started speaking out when they saw injustices. Jenna, in particular, became a vocal advocate for fairness within the department, leading by example and encouraging others to do the same. As for Lily, she continued her work with quiet strength, leading the department with the understanding that change was not a single event, but a long-term commitment. Her leadership became a beacon of hope for those who had been treated unfairly, both inside and outside the department. Her approach wasn't about power or control. It was about building a foundation of respect, accountability, and fairness that would last for years to come. And slowly but surely, the police department began to transform. Lily Moore's story is more than just a lesson about authority and accountability. It's a powerful reminder of how one act of courage can set the stage for lasting change. By standing up to Officer Greg Turner, Lily didn't just confront his disrespect. She challenged the entire department to be better, to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their background or position. The changes that followed weren't immediate, but they were real. Officer Greg Turner, though facing consequences for his actions, began to recognize the importance of humility and respect. And Lily's leadership inspired others to speak out against injustice, ensuring that no one would ever be treated the way she was again. This story shows us that true leadership isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about setting an example, making hard choices, and never accepting things the way they are if they're wrong. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. What would you do if you were in Lily's shoes? How far would you go to make sure that respect and fairness are upheld? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to share and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge the status quo. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another story about courage, change, and the power of standing up for what's right.